Listen to me. Before you look at me and think I'm just an old man telling stories that belong to another century, before you convince yourselves that modern training and better equipment make you immune to what I'm about to say, understand this first. I thought I was ready too. I was young, strong, and full of foolish ideas about honor, purpose, and proving that my life meant something. I grew up in a country where war was presented as a story with a clean ending, full of parades, speeches, and flags waving under a bright sky, and my father, who had fought in the Great War, rarely spoke about it. But when he did, he always ended with the same sentence: "We did what had to be done." And I wanted that sentence to belong to me one day. They trained us hard, marched us until our legs burned, kept us awake until thinking became painful, shouted that mistakes meant death and that the enemy would show no mercy. But all of that happened in places where the world still made sense, where the ground was just ground and not a grave, where cold was uncomfortable but not deadly. When they told me I was going to Stalingrad, not as a regular infantryman, but as an observer, a liaison, a volunteer, I felt chosen and important, convinced I was about to witness history, instead of realizing history was about to carve something out of me and never give it back. The journey itself was a warning I didn't understand at the time. Trains packed with silent men whose eyes looked empty, uniforms already worn thin, and at every stop more wounded climbing aboard than fresh soldiers, men without hands, without eyes, men who looked like they had already died and simply forgotten to fall. I still remember the first breath I took when I stepped off the transport, because it wasn't just cold, it was a cold with intent, wind that cut through wool and skin alike, stiffened my neck in seconds, and made every breath burn like I was swallowing broken glass. And when I finally looked at the city, I understood something was wrong. Because before Stalingrad, I believed a city was a place where people lived. And Stalingrad was no longer living. It was enduring out of spite, with no clean lines, no clear front, every window a potential executioner, every basement hiding something armed, starving, or desperate. Buildings split open like cracked ribs, and factories hollowed out and echoing with death. The noise never stopped. Artillery in the distance, gunfire close enough to feel in your teeth, screams that were sometimes cut short and sometimes not. And worse than all of it, the sudden silence after an explosion, when your mind needed a moment to understand you were still alive. That first night, no one slept. The ground shook even when nothing was falling, as if the earth itself remembered every shell. And I was placed in the corner of a half-collapsed building with no bed, only rubble, dust, and bodies under stiff frozen blankets. And that was when I learned the dead were not buried, not out of cruelty, but necessity, because moving them meant exposure, and exposure meant dying. So they stayed where they fell and became part of the landscape, and I learned not to look at their faces or wonder who they had been. And even then, lying there in the cold, I told myself it was bad but survivable, because I was still an optimist, which meant I was still a fool. I believed the worst enemy would be the Germans, that war was about bullets and tactics and courage, and I didn't yet know that Stalingrad didn't care if you were brave. It only cared how much you were willing to lose. That fear doesn't arrive all at once, but settles in slowly like an illness, taking comfort first, then food, then sleep, and finally hope. And that this was only the beginning, the prologue, before I would see men freeze to death while still standing, before I would kill at arm's length and forget the face I'd shot, before I would genuinely wish for a bullet to end it all. Lessons that came later. And so I tell you now, If you ever believe you're ready for war, it's only because you still don't understand it at all. After the arrival came the understanding, and that understanding was worse than fear, because fear still allows hope, but Stalingrad offered none. And by the second day inside the city, it became clear that this place was not just destroyed, it was alive in a way that hated us, because Stalingrad breathed, and every time it did, someone died. Morning light did not bring relief, it only revealed the damage in sharper detail. Buildings torn open like bodies on a surgeon's table, factories split in half with their insides exposed to the sky, and far away the Volga no longer looked like a river, but like a boundary, a thin, frozen line between life and whatever waited on the other side. A crossing many never survived, and those who did often arrived emptied of something essential. The smell was the first thing that truly settled into you. Not just smoke or gunpowder, but burned flesh, old blood, machine oil, rot, and fear mixed into something thick that clung to your clothes and your throat until you could taste it. And no matter how long you stayed, you never became used to it. Then there were the sounds, not only the explosions you expected, but the small ones that made your heart stop. Bricks sliding somewhere above you, footsteps on a floor you couldn't see, the dry crack of a sniper's rifle followed by a body dropping without a sound. And in Stalingrad, a long scream meant no one was coming. Streets were death corridors, so we moved through shadows and ruins, hugging walls, slipping through shell holes and shattered interiors, every step measured, every corner suspect, every window an open eye waiting to blink. Buildings earned names, not from maps but from blood, places taken in the morning and lost by afternoon, sometimes taken and lost several times in a single day, where men fought not for blocks but for stairwells, hallways, single rooms filled with broken glass, frozen blood, and bodies no one had time to move. The city was never empty. Civilians still lived in cellars and basements, old men, women, children surviving on scraps, some so quiet they seemed invisible, others broken beyond repair. And I remember a woman rocking an empty cradle while shells fell around her, and no one tried to stop her because no one knew how. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. Snipers turned shattered windows into killing eyes, one careless movement enough to end a life, and we learned not to rush to the fallen, because running only added another body to the street. A Soviet lieutenant once told me that here we did not fight for meters, but for seconds, and he was right, because a second of hesitation, exhaustion, or mercy was all it took. Traps were everywhere, staircases wired with explosives, doors tied to grenades, bodies rigged to detonate when touched, and death grew inventive, teaching us to distrust everything, even silence. And yet, in rare moments, something human still surfaced. A cigarette shared behind a wall that blocked the wind, a shaky laugh after surviving a near miss, a piece of bread broken into impossibly small portions. But Stalingrad never allowed those moments to last. And as the front twisted and folded until maps became useless, the fighting grew so close you could hear the enemy breathing through floors and walls, sometimes battling upstairs while they waited below, and we slept in fragments, dreaming of explosions, and waken relieved when the noise was real, because it meant we were still alive. Slowly, without noticing when it began, something inside us changed. The future disappeared, home stopped mattering, and the world shrank to survive in the next hour. Because Stalingrad did not always kill with bullets. Sometimes it killed by erosion, wearing away curiosity, empathy, and even your name, until you became part of it. And by the time you understood what the city was doing to you, it was already breathing inside your chest. It wasn't the gunfire or the bombs that broke men first in Stalingrad. It was what happened in between, and the long stretches where nothing exploded and the mind had nowhere to hide. because that was when you started to notice that something inside you was slipping, quietly, piece by piece. At first it showed in small, almost harmless ways. Men forgetting where they left their rifles, staring at their hands as if they belonged to someone else, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny, or laughing when there was no joke at all. And everyone pretended not to notice, because noticing meant admitting it could happen to you too. Hunger did most of the damage, not the kind of hunger you can imagine from missing meals, but a slow, grinding emptiness where your body began feeding on itself, and your thoughts narrowed until food became the only subject that mattered, and rations grew smaller, frozen solid, sometimes so old they tasted like rust and smoke, bread that had to be chipped apart with a knife, soup that warmed nothing. And soon men talked about meals more than tactics, arguing over recipes, describing imaginary feasts, swearing they could smell kitchens from homes thousands of miles away. And when a man traded his boots for a single potato and ate it raw, no one laughed, and when he cried afterward, no one looked away. Sleep finished what hunger started, because we slept in broken pieces, 10 minutes here, 20 there, always half awake, always listening, and the mind cannot survive like that for long, so it begins inventing things to fill the gaps, voices calling your name, movement in corners that stay empty, the certainty that you are buried alive just before you wake up gasping. The cold sharpened everything, settling deep into bone and marrow, turning fingers numb and useless, blackening toes without warning. And frostbite was cruel because it didn't hurt at first, which meant men kept going until it was too late, cutting dead skin from themselves without flinching. And pain like that narrowed the soul, made men selfish and dangerous. Discipline slowly dissolved, orders were followed more slowly, arguments broke out over nothing, and I saw a fight over a tin cup end with a knife in a man's throat, not because of hatred or ideology, but because exhaustion snapped something fragile inside both of them. Some men shut down completely, stopped speaking, stopped reacting, moved only when told, fired only when ordered, staring into nothing the rest of the time, and we called them the walking dead, though never to their faces, while others went the opposite way, reckless and loud, smiling too much, volunteering for suicidal runs as if they were eager to disappear, and one man kept standing in full view of enemy positions, daring them to shoot him until they finally did. Hallucinations became common, a man trying to share his ration with someone who had been dead for days, another following footprints in the snow straight into enemy fire because he was certain they led home. And then there was the young American from Iowa, still soft-faced when we arrived, hollow-eyed by winter, who began collecting buttons from German uniforms, saying each one marked another day he survived, lining them up carefully every night and speaking to them like friends. And when he died frozen in a doorway with a bullet in his chest, we found dozens of buttons sewn into the lining of his coat, and no one touched them, because somehow that felt right. Fear changed too, at first sharp and useful, later dull and constant, something you stopped reacting to because reacting took energy you no longer had. And that was when men walked into fire simply because their minds were too tired to stop them. Morality didn't survive either. Questions stopped being asked, right and wrong lost meaning, and you did whatever kept you alive another hour, leaving the wounded behind, taking food from civilians who had even less than you, pulling the trigger first just to stop your hands from shaking. And the worst part was that none of it felt shocking for long, because madness did not arrive like a storm, but settled like fog, slow and quiet and everywhere, until by the time we realized what we were becoming, we were already too far gone to care. And that was when I learned the truth no training ever teaches you, that war does not just kill men, it unravels them. And Stalingrad was very, very good at pulling threads. By the time we reached the point where the enemy was only a meter away, the war had stopped feeling like war and started feeling like something personal, something intimate and ugly, because in Stalingrad there were moments when Germans and Soviets, enemies sworn to kill each other, lived separated by nothing more than a broken wall, a floorboard, a staircase choked with rubble, and you could hear them breathe, cough, whisper, pray, and sometimes cry in the dark. This was not combat decided by strategy or firepower, but by nerve, because you fought for rooms the size of closets, for corridors where the walls were slick with blood and soot, for stairwells that changed hands so often no one remembered who had taken them first. Gunfire became secondary, something you used only when necessary, because shooting gave away your position, so killing often happened quietly, with knives, with bayonets, with shovels, with hands wrapped around a throat until the struggling stopped, and you learned what a human body feels like when life leaves it, how heavy it suddenly becomes, how fast the warmth fades in the cold. Grenades were thrown through doorways and down stairwells with quick, practiced motions, followed by a pause where everyone counted silently before the blast, because moving too soon meant dying with the enemy, and sometimes after the explosion, you'd rush in and find nothing but smoke, blood, and pieces of men you could no longer recognize as human. There were moments when you locked eyes with someone just like you on the other side of a room, both of you frozen for a fraction of a second, both understanding exactly what was about to happen, and in that instant you saw fear, exhaustion, and recognition in his face, and then one of you pulled the trigger or lunged forward, and the moment was gone forever. At night, the fighting became even closer, shadows moving through ruins, boots crunching softly on glass, fingers tight on cold steel, and sometimes you waited for hours listening to the enemy just beyond reach, knowing he was doing the same, knowing that one of you would eventually have to move. I remember lying on a floor above a German position, feeling the vibration of their voices through the boards, understanding fragments of words I didn't need to translate, and realizing that if I dropped a grenade through the hole near my hand, I would end lives I could almost imagine continuing in another world. And I dropped it anyway, because hesitation meant death, and because by then, imagination had become a liability. The city forced you to abandon distance, physical and emotional, until killing was done face to face, and survival depended on how fast you could shut off the part of you that recognized another man as human. And that was the true horror of close combat in Stalingrad, not the blood or the noise, but the way it taught you to erase empathy on command, to become efficient at ending lives only an arm's length away. And when dawn came and the firing slowed for a moment, you would realize your hands were shaking not from cold, but from what they had done, and you would push that feeling down because there was no time for it, because in Stalingrad the enemy was never far, sometimes only a meter away, and there was always another room to clear.
The cold in Stalingrad was not just a companion to death. It was a killer that didn't need a gun, a slow, invisible enemy that crept into your bones and refused to leave, and by the time you realized it, it had already begun dismantling every part of you. It started small, with numb fingers that could no longer pull a trigger, toes turning black in boots that once fit snugly, muscles stiffening until even lifting your head became a chore. And the first frostbite didn't hurt because it was subtle, silent, a thief in the night that stole sensation before you could protest, and by the time the pain came, it was often too late to save anything. We tried to fight it, tried to move, huddle, share body heat, but the cold didn't care about strategies or courage. It measured endurance in hours and days, slowly claiming those too weak or too unlucky to stay alive. Men started whispering to each other about warmth as if it were a god, sharing scraps of blankets like treasure, and still it wasn't enough. Some slept where they fell and never woke, their bodies stiff and pale, frozen into the rubble of the city like statues in a tomb, while others made impossible choices, shooting a friend to stop him from freezing to death, because even death had to come on your terms if you wanted to survive. Our weapons often failed in the bitter cold, rifles that jammed, grenades that wouldn't ignite, boots that split and froze into blocks of ice, and every step outside a building felt like walking through a storm that wanted you gone. The wind was crueler than any soldier. It bit through clothes and skin, sank into lungs, made breathing painful, and made every movement an effort you sometimes didn't have the strength to make. Hunger and exhaustion were already close companions, but the cold was a master, and together they unmade men in ways that shooting never could, stripping them of reflex, judgment, and will, until what remained was only the desperate desire to survive one more hour, one more minute, one more breath. I saw a sergeant take a rifle and finish his best friend, because he knew if he fell asleep in the open, the frost would take him anyway, and no prayer or plea could stop it. We carried corpses not out of respect, but because frozen bodies gave a little warmth when pressed against you, and we learned to walk over men as if they were part of the floor, because to hesitate was to join them. The city itself seemed to breathe frost, the walls exhaling ice, the rubble absorbing heat, and the wind moving through broken streets felt like the whisper of death itself, waiting to claim anyone who lingered too long. By the time I realized what the cold was doing to us, it had already begun claiming the strongest, the bravest, the luckiest, and no training, no courage, no prayer could save you from the slow, patient cruelty of winter in Stalingrad. And that is when I understood something essential. In that place, the bullets were not always the deadliest enemy, and survival was not won by skill, but by stubbornness, endurance, and the terrible luck of still breathing when your comrades were already statues of ice.
The dead were everywhere. And in Stalingrad, they were no longer just the bodies of men. They had become part of the city itself, part of its landscape, part of its rhythm, because there were simply too many of them to bury, and moving them was often more dangerous than leaving them where they fell. And then there were the rats. God, the rats. They had grown bold, monstrous with hunger, feeding not only on the dead but sometimes on the living if someone lingered too long. And you quickly learned that silence didn't protect you, that the crunch of a tiny tooth on flesh in the dark was something that could wake you faster than a shell, that their eyes glinting in the rubble were as dangerous as a sniper's. Corpses froze in the streets, in the ruins of houses, and eventually you learned to walk over them, to step carefully, to treat them as part of the floor, because hesitation or compassion would get you killed. Sometimes we used the bodies as barricades, piling them in doorways, stairwells, and windows to stop bullets or grenades, and there was a strange practicality to it, a way of turning death into a tool. But that didn't make it easier to see a friend's face staring blankly from the snow, or to step over a stranger's body without flinching. The smell was constant. Blood, decay, gunpowder, smoke, the frozen scent of life snuffed out, and it mixed with the rats and the cold until breathing itself became an effort, and the mind, already frayed from hunger and fear, began to adjust, began to see the grotesque as normal, to stop reacting, to stop noticing, because noticing meant you might lose your mind. And the rats didn't respect sides. They fed on Germans and Soviets alike, sometimes fighting each other for scraps, sometimes ignoring the living entirely. And we learned to live with them, to push them away with rifle butts, to share space with creatures that had no morality, no hesitation, only survival instinct. And in that, there was a lesson as cruel as the city itself. The world does not care about justice, only about who remains. Sometimes, in moments of quiet, you could hear them squeaking in the dark, moving through walls and debris, and it would feel like the city itself was mocking you, reminding you that death was all around, that it was patient, that it would consume you if you faltered. And in those nights, I often found myself talking quietly to corpses or to the rats, because the loneliness, the horror, and the exhaustion demanded that I acknowledge something, anything alive, even if it was wrong. By the time dawn came and the wind cut through the ruins, we were no longer just soldiers. We were survivors navigating a world that had been emptied of humanity, stepping over frozen friends and enemies alike, living in a city that had become a mausoleum. And I understood then that Stalingrad was not only a battle with the enemy, it was a battle with the dead, with the rats, with the city itself, and that every man who survived was carrying not just memories, but fragments of something unholy, a debt paid in blood and ice that would never leave him.
There comes a point in war, and Stalingrad made sure we all reached it, when you stop being a man and start being a machine of survival, when morality and decency no longer matter, when the only question is whether you will breathe through the next hour or become part of the rubble yourself. And that point came slowly, creeping over us in whispers, in hunger, in exhaustion, until we barely recognized ourselves. Men stopped asking questions. They stopped arguing about right or wrong. They did what they had to do to stay alive. And sometimes that meant leaving comrades behind. Sometimes it meant taking food from civilians who had even less. Sometimes it meant killing first because hesitation was fatal. And all of it became normal, almost routine, because when you are living in a city that has been hollowed by fire, ice, and death, normal is whatever keeps you breathing. I watched men laugh while corpses froze beside them, and I saw others weep silently over scraps of bread they could not share because they themselves needed it more. And no one judged, because judgment was a luxury none of us could afford. Hunger and frostbite and constant gunfire fractured our minds. Hallucinations crept in like unwelcome friends, and soon men were speaking to shadows, following footprints that weren't there, imagining meals that never existed, talking to buttons, to bricks, to anything that offered a sense of control or company. And if you didn't do the same, you felt yourself slipping faster, because the world demanded participation in its madness. Fear became a dull, constant presence. At first it made you cautious. Later it simply existed behind your eyes, a fog that no amount of courage could dispel. And by the time some of us walked blindly into enemy fire, it was not bravery, it was exhaustion, a surrender to the only thing that seemed more powerful than us, the relentless grinding horror of the city. We began to see the enemy not as men, but as obstacles, not as humans, but as part of the landscape of death. And our own reflection became a stranger, a person we barely recognized, carrying out tasks we would have condemned ourselves for at home. The young American from Iowa, still collecting buttons, still talking to them each night, was no longer simply a boy. He was a symbol of the delicate line we all walked between sanity and the abyss. And when he died, frozen in a doorway, we buried him in our memories and went on, because remembering his humanity was too heavy to carry in the moment. By then, the war had taught us the cruelest lesson of all, that men are not broken in a moment, but in many, in small pieces, until they are no longer men at all, only survivors, only bodies and reflexes, only instincts sharpened by horror. And Stalingrad did not forgive, it did not rest, it did not care. And we understood, all of us, that if we survived, we would return home changed, carrying with us fragments of madness, pieces of fear, and the knowledge that humanity is optional when survival is required.
When the German forces finally began to surrender, there was no cheering, no sense of triumph, only silence, so thick it felt like the city itself was holding its breath. And in that silence, we realized that Stalingrad had claimed victory from everyone, that the war had not ended in glory or honor, only in exhaustion and loss, because the enemy we had fought for months, the men we had killed and been killed by, were now hollow-eyed, emaciated, carrying in their faces the same horror we bore, and we understood immediately that this was not a victory that could be celebrated. We had all been reduced to the same state, soldiers and civilians alike, men who had survived on scraps of bread, ice, and the bodies of friends, moving through ruins that smelled of smoke, death, and frost, and the city had already taken what it wanted from us: youth, hope, patience, and the belief that courage could save you. I watched a German officer stagger past, his uniform hanging off him, eyes blank, shaking hands that once held a rifle, and I realized that he and I were no different, that the war had unmade us in parallel, leaving nothing but bodies that could still walk and minds that could barely remember why. Victory tasted like ash in the mouth, like frostbite in the bones, like the empty streets lined with corpses that had not been moved. And when we tried to talk about it later, no one wanted to hear, because the words would carry weight too heavy to bear, because acknowledging what had happened meant acknowledging what we had become. I had lost 20 pounds, my hands shook constantly, and my mind replayed every scream, every hall cleared, every life taken or left behind. And yet we were told that the battle was won, that our side had prevailed, and I could only look at the ruins and know that the city had won over all of us, that it had stripped us bare and demanded we keep walking, keep surviving, keep remembering even when remembering was a curse. Stalingrad did not offer medals or glory. It offered endurance and suffering, and the men who walked away were ghosts walking among the living, carrying the memory of a war that had no winners, only survivors. And every time I close my eyes, I see those hollow faces, both enemy and ally, and I know that this lesson will never leave me. Victory in a place like that is never what it seems, and survival comes with a cost far higher than anyone should ever have to pay.
Returning home from Stalingrad was not a relief. It was a different kind of battlefield, because the war did not end at the border, did not end with the train ride, did not end with the last step onto familiar soil. And I realized almost immediately that the world I had left behind no longer existed for me, or maybe it had never existed at all. Streets that once seemed ordinary now felt like traps. Colors were too bright, sounds too loud, and people moved too fast, as if they had never known hunger that gnawed at your bones, or the cold that turned toes black, or the smell of death that lingered in every corner of a ruined city. I could not sleep for long, and when I did, the dreams returned with perfect clarity. The walls of Stalingrad collapsing, the screams of the men beside me, the rats, the frozen corpses, the eyes of my comrades and enemies staring from the rubble. And I would wake shaking, tasting frostbite, hunger and blood in my mouth. Conversations felt impossible. Laughter was strange, almost alien, and people would ask me about the war as if it were a story, and I wanted to tell them, to scream it into their faces, but the words failed me, or if they came, they sounded thin and wrong, incapable of carrying the weight of months spent in a city that had eaten our humanity. I could not look at young men without seeing the hollow shadows of soldiers long dead, and I could not touch anyone without flinching, as if every contact reminded me of the violence and despair that had been imprinted into my bones. Even the people I loved seemed different, smaller, fragile, unaware, and I wanted to keep them safe, but also feared for them, feared the world, feared the quiet, feared the smell of snow or smoke, because those things were never just natural anymore. They were cues, triggers of memory too terrible to forget. Some nights I would walk the streets alone, pretending to be a civilian, pretending to breathe normally, but my hands would shake and my eyes would see movement in shadows that weren't there, and I knew I was carrying Stalingrad inside me, alive, breathing, relentless, and nothing, not home, not food, not comfort, not sleep, could undo what I had become. Returning home was not returning, it was surviving, and surviving meant walking through a world that no longer had a place for the man I used to be, carrying ghosts that would never let me rest, and understanding finally that some battles never end, they only move inside you, quietly, in the dark, and I would carry that war until the day I died.
Now, after all these years, when I sit and think about Stalingrad, I understand something that no training, no medal, no story could have taught me at the time. That war does not end when the shooting stops, when the enemy surrenders, when the borders are redrawn, or when you set foot on soil that is supposed to be safe, because the real war stays inside you, lodged in your mind and your bones, and it shapes who you are in ways that no one else can see or understand. I think about the men I fought beside, the ones I buried in my memory, the ones I left in ruins or snow, and I carry them still, not as ghosts in the sense that they haunt me, but as fragments of myself that I lost to that city, to that winter, to that horror. And sometimes I wonder if I am even fully myself anymore, or if I am just a collection of memories stitched together with fear, guilt, and survival instinct. I remember the faces of the enemy, the young men who looked like me, the ones I shot, the ones I saw shot, and I realized that in the end we were all victims, all unmade and remade by the city, by the hunger, by the cold, by the endless snow and blood, and the victory that was called ours felt hollow, because nothing Stalingrad gave could ever be taken away. And I have learned that there is no glory in survival, only the quiet, endless reckoning with what you had to do to remain alive. And so I tell you this, the men who listen now, not because I want to scare you, but because I want you to understand that memory is both a gift and a curse. It allows us to remember the dead, to honor what was lost, but it also keeps the war alive inside us, reminding us daily that some places, some battles do not end, that Stalingrad will breathe in me forever, shaping my nights, my dreams, my quiet moments. And the one lesson I hope you take from this is not about strategy, not about courage, not about medals or history books, but about truth, that the cost of war is paid in ways that cannot be repaid, and that surviving it does not make you a hero, it makes you human in the most terrible, fragile way imaginable. And remembering it honestly, carrying it as it is the only way to keep from being swallowed entirely.